Module 14, this week's film, Pan's Labyrinth. This is one of the most beautiful films that we'll see in the whole semester in terms of visuals, both in the cinematography and the set design, and then the costumes that are created for the fairy tale world of the film. Just exquisitely done. This is written and directed by Del Toro. Probably many of you know his work. You've seen Hellboy, he's done that, Devil's Backbone, and then he most recently won an Academy Award for Best Director in The Shape of Water. Del Toro was born in Guadalajara. Some of the actors you see there. And then, simply put, this could be described as a dark fairy tale. Give you a little context. This takes place in post-Civil War Spain. Franco's taken power after there's a fight between those that want a democracy and those that want a fascist government, nationalism, strong sense of nationalism, and they win out. Franco is one that's put in charge of this, and he becomes a military dictator, and his regime lasts for a long time. So even though this movie takes place and there's hope for it right at the end of the Civil War, they don't succeed. The rebels don't succeed, and then it's a fascist regime for those many years after. The narrative. Another story about good versus evil. Humans tend to tell these stories all the time, but this one's wrapped in a fairy tale. So probably one of the ones that we can equate this most directly to is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and that was a rebellious, yet a rebellious protagonist, and that was fighting against an authoritarian regime. These things happen here, but now this story is told in a very, very different way, that being a fairy tale. This allows Del Toro to tell the story through the use of symbolism and visual metaphors, and there are a ton of them throughout here. And layers of them. For example, the toad and the pale man represent the captain, the protagonist's evil father. But then he, in turn, really represents Franco and the fascists. So there's multiple levels to this storytelling. It's the very same theme as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but presented in a very, very different type of storytelling. One of the things that's common to it is the protagonist, the heroine, in this case, our hero, must accomplish 3 tasks. This is pretty traditional storytelling. Here's 3 things that you must achieve before you can rescue the princess from the tower. It's the case here. What's a little bit different about this, though, is that instead of a male protagonist, you have a strong female protagonist. And we have seen those this semester. In the films, some of the films that we've watched. A couple things about Del Toro. He is known for kind of creating sympathetic characters and then having them be challenged by otherworldly characters in these larger-than-life type stories. Certainly the case in this film. Jack Zipes points out that Ophelia, our protagonist, wills herself into this tale and creates it so that she can deal with realistic forces that are impinging on her. So it brings to question, he kind of brings up the question of what the fairy tale, that vehicle, provides her as a young person. And fairy tales are often used to present, if you will, in a much more mild-mannered way to children some complex details of human behavior. Now, not that this is any more simplistic, and you could argue that the fairy tale world in this film is just as brutal and just as dangerous as her real world. But that's what we're attempting to do here. There's a pretty interesting academic article, more than one actually, on this film. An academic article means that generally a PhD or a PhD candidate finds some themes in a film and then writes an academic paper on them, article. And in this case, there's one by this lady, and it's called Narrative Desire and Disobedience in Pan's Labyrinth. And the article that she writes is she's looking at resistance coded in disobedience. And you can see that this is very much like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in the sense of disobedience in reaction to a totalitarian environment. And she goes on in great detail to explain how this works. But for us, what's important here is that she goes one step further and suggests that storytelling itself is a vital and important vehicle for resistance to oppression and as a mechanism for social change. So what she is finding in this story and then others that she'll connect to is that when we see heroic figures and when we see them in a rebellious and disobedient state to authoritarian societies, that this becomes a positive theme for stories. And she even goes so far as to say that it's an important means of expression. So this story definitely is a story of rebellion, and there's a number of layers of that. In the real world, it's done by the rebel forces, in the home, and then in the fairy tale world, it's done through Ophelia. She is questioning authority, and we've seen this as a theme throughout the semester. And one of my hopes at the end of the semester is you can look back and see the importance of that and then the reason why. A labyrinth, kind of important to point this out, it's a place of intricate passageways, tunnels, and blind alleys. They don't always have to be buried, but they often are. Remember our visual metaphors, they're a representation of something through a connection of the image. And then for those that are unfamiliar, fascism, that's an authoritarian, nationalistic, right-wing government, and they still exist today, so you need to keep your eyes out for them. The cinematography here, as I mentioned in the open, is brilliant. It's filmed in central Spain, wins an Academy Award for Best Cinematography, Production Design, and Makeup, and you'll see why. You can stop most any place in the film and analyze the lighting setup, camera placement, what the colors and textures are. It's brilliantly done. Watch for camera movement and the color palette, how it changes, how it gets a little desaturated when we see the captain and his soldiers, and watch how that changes when we move into the underworld in the fairy tale. It tends to be more saturated, the colors begin to pop. It's a more active visual environment. It does cleverly use wipes. We've talked about wipes when we talked about editing, and there's a couple of times that the wipes are used quite cleverly as the camera dollies behind a tree is one, and it opens up into another scene there. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Watch how the camera does move between reality, her reality, and the fairy tale world. And sometimes there's a transition and sometimes there isn't. There's a number of scenes where the camera movement actually follows her in real story time from one world to the next. And doesn't always cut between these worlds. Overall, the editing is right on point with everything else in the film. Brilliant acting as well. The mother, the child, and captain are believable. They are relevant, and they bring this theme and the story to life. Listen to the changes in the sound between the real and the magical world. And if you are watching this on a DVD with surround sound, you'll notice how wonderful the track is. So that's what we have this week. I wish you a lot of luck. Just get through this week, 2 more left, and we'll see you then.